Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Farm Tables class with Kristy Allen on beekeeping and sustainable beekeeping. It's really fun to have you here. This should be a really interesting topic tonight. I'm the program director at Farm Table. I recognize some of your names anyway. Some of you are probably new to us. And I also want to thank Marine Mills Folk School, as they have co-sponsored the event tonight. I know some of you came to the class through them. And they're a folk school on Marine on St. Croix. And I'll read their mission out to you here. Their mission is to support communities and strengthen connections by inviting all people to discover the joy of creating together through traditional arts and crafts. And we hope to be co-sponsoring some things with them in the future too. A word about our mission. Our mission is to build local food culture. And there's a variety of ways we do that. We have a restaurant in Amory that serves the majority of food from farmers within about 40 miles of the restaurant. So we really focus on local food and supporting the local economy, partly to support conservation, to build community, and then teaching the crafts of local food, whether that be growing or preserving or serving or cooking good, wholesome food. And we actually serve Kristy's Beez Kneez honey at the restaurant and also sell it. So we've got a retail section and Kristy sells some of her delicious honey there. So that's by way of introduction. And Kristy, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
I will in my talk, but yeah, we can start after the question and then I'll introduce myself more. Okay, so my question for everyone, just so I can sort of know where everybody's coming from a little bit, is if you have any experience beekeeping, or what's your interest in bees, I guess.
Hi, Mike. Yes, my husband and I have been doing bees for about 4 years now, and just always interested in learning new things. This year we had 4 hives, and then our 5th one, we took care of a 5th hive for a friend and shared the honey. So just excited to learn some new things.
Great. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks, Bonnie. I see a name, Kazua. Sorry. Sorry, if you can say your name correctly and answer the question. I'm sorry.
No, you did. You said it right. It was Kazua.
Okay, great.
I have never raised bees before. I've always been really interested, and my brother, actually, he's not able to make it, but he was the one who was like, hey, let's do bees. And I was like, okay, like I don't know anything about it. So now I'm just scrambling to get as much resources as possible so we can start. And we're gonna be having beehives at Big River Farms, and I'm the education manager there too. So there's space there, and right now we don't really have any farmers that are doing that. We just have Stillwater Bee Club, but we want to be able to bring that education to farmers because we have so much space. And so teaching farmers do that, and also want to work on creating a youth program that, you know, because kids are learning about bees is a really cool thing. But I've always loved local honey. I have friends around me that have bees just down the street from me, and I live in Falcon Heights. So I want to educate people about how viable it is and how great they are for our ecosystem.
Very cool. Thanks, Kazua.
Thank you. Yeah, Big River Farms, just a shout out. It's a great organization and providing land access to those who sometimes don't have access. And they're just pretty close to Marine on St. Croix. And we've been out there, and I'm going to meet with their program director tomorrow. So thanks. Good to have you here. Nicole, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, hello. I'd like to have my video on, but I have very slow internet, so I'll stay just on audio. My name's Nicole, and I've never raised bees, but I am really interested in herbalism, and I've used beeswax and other bee products before, so I'm really curious about raising my own bees in order to have a more closed loop system on my own farm or garden. And I'm especially curious about keeping the bees over winter and how bees can survive in the cold, especially in this climate. So I'm really excited for the class.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Tonight is the first challenge for them. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Nicole. Lindsay, see your name next.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Lindsay Hoffman, and I also have slow internet connection, so I won't be able to use my video, unfortunately. I am a beekeeper and have been a beekeeper for the last 4 years. Actually, I've talked to Kristy a couple of times in the past. I live in Red Lodge, Montana, and but grew up in Minnesota, and have taken the University of Minnesota's Beekeeping 101 class, and I think their second one as well. I am a part of the Billings Yellowstone Valley Beekeepers Club and just can't get really enough information. And I really enjoy talking about bees, learning about bees. So I'm excited for tonight, and I've actually asked some of our club members to join. So you may see some other Montanans join tonight.
Cool. Thanks, Lindsay. Good to hear from you.
Yes, thanks. I've been talking up the bee's knees quite a bit. So if you get an influx from Montana, you know.
All right. I'll look for that. Thank you.
Thanks for tonight, you guys.
Mm-hmm.
You bet. Let's see, William.
Yeah, I'm Will Whitesell. I've never done bees, but I'm quite interested in getting started in it. My older brother actually has done bees in the past and owns a business with where he pours candles and ear candles and all those kind of different things he sells on the internet and in person and stuff. So it's kind of a family thing. Hopefully, we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Will. Adrias wasn't able to unmute, so I'll read what's in the chat box. You can see it there. I've been studying beekeeping for 4 or 5 years, but only got started 2 years ago. Got a head start by working for a commercial beekeeping company. My goal is to learn queen insemination. I was scheduled for Susan Kobe's class this year, so we're looking at next year. Building bees is also a big love of mine. I've loved propagating them. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Adrias, Susan Colby is kind of the cream of the crop for artificial insemination. And I have a good friend who is breeding queens from her line. And I've had some of her Caucasian bees that performed really well here, especially with propolis. But that's really cool. And I'm sorry you didn't get to take her class.
Great. Well, we've got Tara, and I'm going to step away. Someone's having a hard time getting in. I'm going to send a Zoom link again. But Tara, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Tara. I actually saw on the Montana Facebook page. I am from Billings, Montana. And an ex of mine dropped a hive off at my house on Wednesday of last week. And so I'm trying to learn as much as I possibly can right at this very moment. So I've like YouTubed and the Bee Bible, and I went to play some Bozeman. And so I'm trying to like really soak it all in because I want to try to save this hive. So that's my story.
Yeah, I don't know what I can do for you in an hour, but it'll be a learning experience, that's for sure. Yeah.
I think we've got Mike now. If
okay.
Mike is there.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you? Okay. Been fascinated with bees. 40 years ago, I thought about doing bees. Life got in the way, kids got in the way, mortgages got in the way, didn't do anything. I'm in a position in my life. I have a little bit of property and I have several friends who are beekeepers, and I decided to take the plunge. So I've already got a couple of hives, but there are no bees in them yet. I'm going to start it next spring. So I'm just looking forward to it.
Very cool.
Oh, no worries. My experience with beekeeping is 0.
That's right. You're not the only one.
Awesome.
Well, glad you're all here. And so Kristy, take it away. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone for sharing that. It just gives me a good idea of where everybody's at before I start my talk. I'm going to cover a lot of information, and it's going to be a mix of background and where I'm coming from as a sustainable beekeeper to help you understand your own journey as a beekeeper. And I will go into the biology of bees, an introduction to that. So those of you with 4 to 5 years experience, this might be a little bit of a review, but I find when I talk to different beekeepers, I always learn something new, even if it's the basic stuff. And then I'll talk about the way that I keep bees here in the Northland, where, you know, it gets really cold and we have a short season for honey. So let me just share my screen and get to my slides here. So my name is Kristy Lynn Allen. I'm owner and head beekeeper of a business called the Beez Kneez. I started this business in 2010. So I celebrated 10 years on Halloween of 2020. And what a year to celebrate 10 years of business. But it all started, and I bring up the bikes, and we'll talk about bikes and sustainability, but how I started my business and how I kind of grew it around bees. This is my aunt and uncle's commercial beekeeping operation. They're up in northern Minnesota near Deer River, and he's a commercial beekeeper, so he's migratory, and he moves his colonies to California every year to pollinate almonds in the wintertime. And I went to work for him in 2009 and 2010 harvesting honey. You'll see the picture up in the right corner is my first attempt at lifting a heavy super of honey. You know, honey weighs 50 to 100 pounds in a box, depending on what size box you're using. So it's no joke heavy. And there's other ways to do it that make it less heavy, but just keep that in mind if you're thinking about beekeeping, that it gets heavy. So the first time my uncle opened a hive with me, I totally fell in love with bees. The way it smelled, the way that the bees were communicating and buzzing, and the taste of real honey, I was totally hooked. And you know a real beekeeper when you open a beehive and they lean in instead of backing away, because it really takes that fascination of what's going on for you to stick with it, I think. So anyway, I started working with my uncle for a couple years, and I would source his honey. And then I lived in Minneapolis at the time, and I would sell honey by delivering it on my bicycle. I literally went door to door, and I dressed up like a bee on Halloween, and it just stuck. And that's the pun I like to use. But it was really great because it was a time when colony collapse disorder was really starting to make headlines in the news, and people were really, really worried and curious and interested about what was going on with the bees. And so I decided that I would dress up like a bee on Halloween, paint my bike like one. And that's literally how I started the business. I rode around and gave people a honey sample with my business card. And then I started to get into co-ops, and I did farmers markets, and it just continued to grow that way. From 2012 to 2014, I did a youth-based education program with another woman who used to work at the Bell Museum. And we would actually just open the hive with children and show them what was going on with the bees, and talk about their connection to our food system. One of the biggest hurdles with bees is that people are scared of them because they sting, but they're incredibly important, and you know, they're struggling to survive in our current environments. And so we thought it would be really great to get the youth on board and expose them. And it was really, really great programming while we were able to do it. Erin, my former partner, she moved on and she started a nonprofit where she still does that work, but I continued on as a for-profit business. And I started to place hives in Minneapolis on certain rooftops and different areas, and I would label the honey by the zip code specific. And so I worked with, and I still, at what COVID capacity I can, work with some of these places to put hives and then do that very specific, site-specific honey labeling. And the honey, it tastes different based on geography, right? And so where the bees are and what they're feeding on will determine the flavor of honey. And we thought that was a really cool way to educate about honey and to also market our product.
Kristy, we have a question.
Sure.
Back to your uncle, just curious how many hives your uncle runs.
So my uncle's on the small side of commercial beekeeping, and we're going to talk a little bit later on about commercial beekeeping versus, sustainable beekeeping and the differences there. But he runs about 1,000, and the largest beekeeper in the United States is around 50,000 hives. So he's kind of on the smaller end, and he's still, he sells all of his honey direct and doesn't sell it to a large packer. The honey industry is a little bit like the dairy industry in that, most beekeepers are selling their honey to big honey packers, and they heat it up and mix it all together and microfilter it and things like that. So, so I also, in 2013, we did a Kickstarter and raised $40,000 to open a community beekeeping center in Minneapolis that I still am managing today. But I live out in Western Wisconsin at the moment. So there's plans to eventually move things more this direction, depending on what happens with COVID and everything else. But this is my shop, and we sell our honey, and we do classes. And we also rent out our pedal-powered honey I'll get to that in a moment. But this is the pictures of the front of the building. This is during the George Floyd protests. We're very close to the 3rd precinct, so this summer was challenging for a lot of reasons, but we actually worked with a local artist to paint this beautiful mural on the wall to kind of honor what's going on in the city. And we've had, to really adjust to everything that's been happening this year. So things are a little bit different. But we do sell beekeeping supplies as well. And that's been going on for the last 3 or 4 years now. We partner with a company out in upstate New York called Better Bee, and we really like them because their equipment is very high quality and they're beekeepers themselves, so it makes it really easy to work with their products. They have a very similar beekeeping model to ours. I also invented a pedal-powered honey extractor, which I've subsequently sold several units. One to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, a couple to private people, a place called 21 Roots Farm that works with people with disabilities. So it's something I'm very proud of, and we actually rent these out by the hour at our shop. So in this photo, you can see the honey extraction process going on, and removing the wax and then putting in the machine. And one thing I really like about this particular machine is it tilts totally forward. So those of you who have extracted honey, you know how sticky and messy and what a pain in the butt it can be to get out of some of these extractors. But I was given a broken hand crank extractor, and I worked with my bike mechanic friend. I literally paid him with a 6-pack of beer, and we started designing these extractors. Oops. The other thing we do at the Beez Kneez, I've been teaching and running a program called Camp Beez Kneez for the past 6 years. And so this is a 12 to 14 week intensive beekeeping program where we give you your own hive to manage, but we assist you throughout the entire year. I really enjoy this program. It's really helped us build a beekeeping community and teach people things that normally would take them years to learn, just because of the experience of myself and the other instructors that we've had. Just to give you a background on me, I spent I've been beekeeping for 11 years, and I worked at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab for my uncle. I worked at Mdewakanton Sioux community in Prior Lake, where they had 100 hives, and I've been managing about 150 hives for the last 5 years. So this is just a shot of one of the classes. And then this year it was really, questionable whether it would happen, but we did, because we were outside and everybody was masked, and I put all the hives 6 feet apart. We were able to hold classes until the fall. And we plan to do it next year as well, because all of the way that it's set up is doable with the restrictions of COVID, depending, again, we'll see how things go, but it was really nice to be able to provide that for people during this time, but also for us to continue to be able to teach those classes. This is a shot, it's actually at Lily Springs Farm. We have 3 teaching sites, 2 in Minnesota and 1 in Wisconsin. Here's a shot of our honey that we sell, and we do a mustard as well. Like I mentioned, I keep over 150 hives. A large chunk of those are at local farms, sustainable farms, that I'm very picky about where I put bees because of pesticide kills I've had on my hives in the past, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But on the left, that's a picture of Turnip Rock Farm, and they have an incredible farm with pasture-raised dairy cattle, and the bees did so well there, and I knew it was because of the pasture. And so I'm really passionate about promoting this kind of farming, because it really does matter when it comes to honey production and bee health. On the right is Blackbrook Farm, and just the other farms we work with, which most of them, or a couple of them at least, sell product to Farm Table Foundation. So they're familiar with these farmers. Common Harvest Farm, Lily Springs Farm, Burning River, Trade River Ranch is mine. This is my home. I've got about 20 hives at this place, and this is where I raised queens as well. And I moved out to this area 3 years ago because it's such a great place for bees, but also there's such an incredible network of local farmers that I've been working with for years.
Hey, Kristy?
Yeah.
Someone had a question, just kind of curious, why mustard? How did that come into the mix?
Yeah, so, honey is something that not every year you make the same amount. And as a honey producer that likes transparency with my products, we wanted a value added that involved honey but wasn't all honey. Plus my partner is a sausage maker and a chef, and he came up with the recipes for the mustard. And so they're really, really good European style with a lot of flavor. And so that's essentially where the mustard came from. And we plan to do more value added with honey products in the future. Any other questions before I move on?
Well, I would just reiterate that, yeah, quite a few of those farms are some of the main ones we work with, and it's neat to see that you're there, and they really are a good group of folks.
Yeah, yeah. So now I'm gonna get to kind of like the downer part of my talk, but I promise I'll end on a happy note. Getting into keeping bees, I was very, I was very aware of why the bees were struggling, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but until it really happens to you and you get an indication of what the bees are exposed to, it's kind of hard to put into a personal context and understand. And so I like to tell this story about what happened to us early on, because it really, I think, paints a picture of the beekeeping situation right now, or the situation that bees and other pollinators are under. So what you're looking at is labeled pretty clearly. It's a acute pesticide kill, and on the left is a normal hive in a backyard, and this was Minneapolis in 2013, and on the right was this person's hive after she harvested the honey and brought it back, she found all of her bees dead and dying in front of the colony. And we also had hives within a quarter mile, and there was another beekeeper within a quarter mile of there. And the only reason we were able to communicate was because we had this honey house that we'd started, and she had extracted honey at our honey house. And we told her to go put her supers back on the colony and to clean out the excess honey, and that's what she found. And she'd also worked at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab, and I'll talk about them a lot because they're they're one of the best bee labs in the country, if not the world, and they're an incredible resource for beekeepers. And they came out and did an investigation, and we found out that the bees were indeed killed by pesticides that somebody sprayed in the neighborhood, and they sprayed so much of it that it was able to kill 3 hives within a quarter mile. We got really mad and activated and got very much involved in bee advocacy work. So we started a campaign called Healthy Bees, Healthy Lives. We went to the Capitol, and I testified 5 times at the Capitol, which it was something I had never done before, being that involved in our democratic process. And we actually were successful in passing 2 bills in Minnesota. One was the Beekeeper Compensation Bill, which provides restitution for beekeepers if their colony is affected by pesticide poisoning. And the other one was a nursery plant labeling law. That what we found out in doing all this work around bee health and bee death, and there was a lot going on at the time in the news as well, was that plants and nurseries were pre-treating plants with neonicotinoids. And you've probably heard about neonicotinoids in the news before. It's a systemic pesticide that is coated on the seed of the plant, but when the plant grows and it gives off pollen and nectar, the bees get microdosed with pesticides, and it's actually over time will really negatively impact the bee and then kill them. So there was a law that was passed along with this one that said that any nursery selling a plant and labeling it as bee friendly couldn't do that if it had been treated with one of these chemicals. In 2015, the very next year, we had another pesticide kill. And this was in Scandia, Minnesota. And I had bees on a friend's land who also had bees, and both of our hives, we lost a bunch of bees. And I was like, oh my God, I've seen this before. And when you see it once, you know what it looks like. And it's piles of dead bees out in front, kind of writhing on their backs. And what had happened was a farmer who was planting corn was planting on a very windy day in the middle of the afternoon, and 90% of corn seed is pre-treated with neonicotinoids in the Midwest. And when they drill the seed into the ground, the powder coating of that chemical kind of poofs out and affects all the pollinators and anything foraging in the area. So we had a bee kill after we got this law passed, and we ended up being the only beekeepers to benefit from the law, where we went through a 9-month investigation and found out that it was in fact the corn planting that killed our bees. And I got, I think it was $1,500 from the Minnesota Department of Ag Pesticide Regulatory Division to pay for my dead bees. But then they weakened the law after that, and I sat on a committee that reviewed pesticide kills on hives for a long time, and it was just so hard to for beekeepers to prove what had happened that it became kind of, a law with no teeth, more symbolic. And we can talk about that more later. So anyway, as bee advocates and as beekeepers, we asked people to do these 4 things: take a pollinator pledge, advocate for pollinator-friendly policies, plant pollinator-friendly plants, and then just be careful about what you're purchasing and how it affects bees. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Well, now I'll move on to more of an introduction into bee biology, and then I'll talk more about actually managing colonies. So for those of you who don't know, honeybees are social insects. And when we say social insects, we don't mean like, oh, they're really gregarious and they like to talk and hang out and go to the bar. It means that they function as a society that has different roles and different jobs to kind of make the whole colony function as a whole. And so, you know, you have different members of the hive that do different things, and their interactions are really benefiting the whole. So it's one of the reasons I really fell in love with bees. I have a bachelor's in global studies, and I thought bees communicated and organized themselves way better than human beings, and it was very inspiring to me. And it's run by women, so that was another piece of it. Speaking of women, the queen. So the colony has 3 members, like I said, the queen, the workers, and the drones. The queen, there's only one of, and she is basically the heart of the colony. And this particular queen, I really like because it doesn't look like a typical honeybee queen that you might see. She's a special breed of queen bee that comes from a program in at Purdue that they bred a bee that actually will chew mites off of their sisters and brothers. So they call it the Purdue ankle biter. And scientists discovered that the bees had learned how to bite the legs off of the varroa mite, which is the honeybee's #1 predator. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But this, the queen, she's the heart of the colony, although a lot of people think she's in charge, and that's just not the case. It's actually the workers that make all the decisions, but she's really important that if something's wrong with her, she's sick or whatever, the bees will replace her, but they don't function very well without her either. Everyone thinks that she has the best job. I think she has the worst job. She goes out, she gets mated once by 15 to 20 different drones, 60 feet in the air. They call it a drone congregation area. I've only ever seen it once, and it's very difficult to see because it is so high up. But the way that you see it is that you'll find drones that have fallen from the process of mating, because what happens is they will mate with her, and they use their insect penis, which is called an endophallus, and one will put his in, and then it breaks off and he falls to the ground, and then another one comes, pulls that out and puts his in, and that happens 15 to 20 times. And the reason for it is that you're going to get a big diversity of genetics if you're having sperm from 15 to 20 different drones in the area. So it's actually for the genetic diversity of the colony. So after she's mated, she comes home, and she never leaves the hive again. She just lays eggs for the rest of her life. It used to be that queens would live 3 to 7 years. It's really uncommon. I mean, I have some 2 to 3-year-old queens, but it's definitely not the majority. It's the minority. They live more, anywhere from 3 months to a year. That has a lot to do with all the stresses that honeybees are under at the moment. All right. The workers. So the workers, they do all the work in the hive, hence the name workers. And they start as very young. When they're very young, they are nurse bees, which they take care of the young, the larva of the colony, but they also take care of the queen. And as the bees grow older, their jobs change. So they'll do housekeeping, they'll be nurse bees, They'll do guarding the hive. Then their last stage of life is actually foraging, which in the summertime, the average worker bee lives 4 to 6 weeks. And so she goes out and she's collecting collecting nectar and pollen for the last 4 to 6 weeks of her life. And then she literally wears her wings out and dies, or she gets eaten by a bird, or any number of things that can happen. But the lifespan of a worker bee in the summertime is 4 to 6 weeks. In the wintertime, the winter workers, they actually live for 6 months. And we'll talk about that more in a bit. The drones, if you can see the difference between the bees in this photo, the drones are much larger. We like to say they're double fat, and a lot of people, new beekeepers, will mistake the drone for the queen. And the easiest way for me to tell the difference is that the drones have those really big bulbous eyes on their head, and they also, as opposed to the queen, who has that kind of pointy, long body, drones, it's more blunted and kind of almost an oval shape. And so I've been teaching beekeepers for 6 years now, and everybody wants to see the queen. There's only one of her, and she's beautiful, I get it, but in beekeeping, the most valuable lesson that I've learned over the years is you as much as you want to see her, it's more important to see evidence of her, because you can do a lot of damage looking for the queen if you're messing with the hive too much. So drones only have one job really, and that's to mate with the queen. Their sisters feed them and really take care of them. They do release some pheromones in the hive, and they are incredibly important. But at the end of the year, in the fall time, drones get kicked out. Their sisters literally will bite their legs and wings off and throw them out the hive. Sounds brutal, but remember that as a social organism, they really are concerned about the survival of the colony, and keeping drones around when there's very little to none resources out in the landscape is not efficient or useful for them. So bees develop a lot like butterflies in that they have the egg stage, and this is also an incredibly, I would say, the most important thing in beekeeping to learn how to do is to see those eggs, because the eggs are an egg for 3 days, and if you see an egg, it means you have a queen, or you have had one within the last 3 days. And so they're really small, as you can see from the photo, and most wax is white, kind of yellowish, and so it can be really difficult to see. But I would encourage you, when you start, really you want to try and find eggs. And the easiest way to find eggs is if you look at that bee up in the top part of the photo. She's really kind of fuzzy and small, and she's a young nurse bee, and the nurse bees are going to be around the queen, and they're going to be around the young eggs and larvae. And so the queen starts in the middle of the frame and she works her way out. And so if you're struggling to see eggs, look for a frame that has not a whole lot of cells that are full of other things, and maybe you saw the queen, then you'll have eggs nearby. Vice versa, if you see eggs, the queen might be nearby as well. But look in the middle of a frame, or look on the very outer edges of what's called sealed brood, which I'll show a picture of. The second stage is larva, and so that egg will hatch into a larva, and the bees will feed the larva royal jelly and what's called bee bread, which is a fermented mixture of pollen and nectar. And little known fact is that honeybees are the only animal on the planet that technically cooks their food, and in that they take they take the nectar and the pollen, they mix it together and make a different product. Also, nectar, they turn it into honey. It's not honey in the form that you eat it before the before you get it, the bees turn it into honey by dehydrating it and adding some enzymes and yeah, it's pretty incredible. Anyway, so the larval stage, so the egg is an egg for 3 days, and then the larva has what's called 5 instars, and it will get capped off after it curls and turns around. And if you have a chance, there's this really great National Geographic video that shows the development of a bee underneath the comb from egg to adult. That's really great. And they do it kind of in time lapse so you can see things happen. This is what sealed brood looks like. So this is the last stage of the honeybee's development. It takes 21 days for a worker to develop, 24 days for a drone, and 16 days for a queen. So they're going to remain under the cappings for 10 days until they emerge as adults. And they literally chew their way out of their cell, and they turn around and they clean it out and they get right to work. This is what a queen cell looks like. This is something that you really want to know the difference between a queen cell and a drone cell, because there's a lot of things that can happen along the beekeeping journey. If you see queen cells, it can mean different things. Either the bees are making a new queen or they're trying to swarm. And if you get advanced enough into beekeeping, and there was a few of you who talked about this a little bit, the interest of raising queens, which I love and just learned about 3 or 4 years ago. And it totally changed my experience with beekeeping. And I think is a foundational part to sustainable beekeeping. So important thing is to know your numbers. Like I talked about the stages of development. So you'll have that egg stage. It's all the same until, except the duration. And the difference between the queen and the workers is that the queen gets fed royal jelly her entire egg to the larval stage, and she gets capped over at day 8, and then the last 8 days she develops into a queen. And it's incredible how quickly the queens will develop, and the difference between the workers and the queens. So the pupal stage, and that's when it gets capped over, right? So you have 8 days in the work between the worker, larval and pupal stage, 3 days between the queen, and then 7 days between the drone. And I like to use a little rhyme, worker, to help you remember. Worker bees, they can go to the bar when they're 21. The queen, sweet 16, and drones, 24 out the door. And the reason I say 24 out the door is one of the things that we do for sustainable beekeeping management when it comes to the #1 pest, which is the varroa mite. And if you don't learn how to manage this mite, your bees will die. The mite came over in the late 1980s from Asia, and we have a different species of honeybee than they do in Asia that is not adapted to this mite. And it's been a huge challenge for beekeepers. And I'll talk about it in a second. But drones, one way why you should know the life cycle of a drone is you can actually fish for mites by using trapping them in drone cells. And because you know when that pupal stage, when they get capped over, the mites actually move in underneath the larva and they feed on the larva, and then they get capped over and they reproduce, and then they explode in population when that bee emerges from its cell. And so if you're able to capture them in drones, because drones take much longer to produce, then you can really reduce your mite numbers without using treatments.
Hey, Kristy.
Yeah.
Lindsay asks, are there benefits that you know of for humans to eat royal jelly?
There's an entire healthcare, alternative healthcare industry on royal jelly. I've tried it. It's really gross. Don't eat it straight. But yeah, there's an industry, there's in Asia for sure, they use it for, I think, like pregnant women, I've heard taking it, but I don't know a ton about that specifically. Yeah. But it is an incredible, it's an enzyme that comes out of the bees. It secretes out of a gland in their head. And it's full of, vitamins and nutrients that the bees need to grow. And so I imagine, if that crosses over to humans in some regard. Most bee products are incredibly good for you and pretty amazing in chemistry. Honey never expires or spoils. Propolis is it's a resin that the bees will seal up their hive with, and it's collected on trees. And so the bees will bring it back to the hive, and the University of Minnesota, in fact, some of the research assisting I did at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab was collecting propolis off the legs of bees to study its benefits. And they would inoculate hives with this disease called American foul brood, and the bees that were better at collecting propolis were able to fight off the disease. And they found that they use it like a pharmacy. And so there are efforts, and I actually sell a piece of equipment that you can scrape the inside of a box, and the bees will fill it with propolis. And propolis is, if you think about bees living in nature, they live in a tree cavity, which is going to be rough on the inside, and they use propolis to coat the walls like we paint our walls. And so the inside of a beehive will be totally smooth. But commercial beekeepers a long time ago, in an effort to have bees that produce more honey and less propolis, we have them in these boxes that have smooth walls. But I've been starting to use more and more what we call propolis hive bodies to get the bees to be bringing in more propolis.
A couple other questions.
Yeah.
Let's see. How do you capture the mites from the drones?
Well, I'm going to show some photos a little bit later on. I just wanted to get through the bee biology part. But for those of you who don't know how bees communicate, they do the waggle dance, which will tell other bees where flowers are. They also have scout bees that go out and look for homes, and they'll come back and communicate with pheromones and dancing. I highly recommend, if you haven't heard of Dr. Tom Seeley, he wrote an incredible book called Honeybee Democracy that talks about swarm behavior and the way that bees communicate. And he's written several books. And he also recently, he does a lot of interviews. I've met him several times and seen him talk at different bee talks. But I really like his approach, because I think to be a successful beekeeper, you have to understand how they function as an organism. And if you think of just one individual bee, you're going to have a hard time understanding the colony is the actual organism. It's a super organism. It's kind of like your body. The bees are like individual cells that all work together to make things function. Similarly, in a hive, they all have to be doing their job and healthy and working together for them to succeed and continue on year after year.
What was the name of that book again, Kristy?
Honeybee Democracy is his first book. He has his most recent one. Oh man, I'm gonna blank on the name, but just look for the most recent. I think it came out 2019. But he studies how bees live in nature. He actually he's from Cornell, and he has an island that he studied bees and whether they could build resistance to the varroa mite. And successfully they did when they were left alone, but a lot of them had to die in order for that resistance to come about. And some of the work that I'm doing locally with my own beekeeping and working with other small scale beekeepers, we're trying to overwinter bees and identify the hives that perform the best over winter, that are gentle but mite resistant. And there's more and more people agreeing that this is the way forward, that the bees, they'll figure it out over time, but at the moment we're in an epidemic. I mean, the bees are going through a pandemic just like we are with the varroa mite. It spreads virus and disease, and it's really hard to isolate your hives in a way that they're not going to be impacted by varroa mite. And so until we get to a point where all of the bees are mite resistant, you're just going to continue to fight an uphill battle against them. And I am from the organic farming community. I don't like using things in the hive that, seem harmful, or I don't want to treat those colonies, but there are things you have to do, and there are things you can do that are nearly as detrimental and get into the comb or form antibiotic resistance. So beekeepers are running out of tools, especially commercial beekeepers who are having to treat for mites 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 10 times a year, treating these varroa mites with antibiotics, and the mites keep building resistance to different things that they've been using, and they're kind of on their last effectual antibiotic, and they're starting to see a little bit of resistance. So it was more reason for me in the beginning to figure out how to take care of bees in a way where I could, get them closer to that point where they can handle the mites on their own. But again, it's still a humongous problem, and you have to take it seriously as a beekeeper. So, should I look at this chat?
I'm tracking it for you.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what sustainability in the beekeeping industry means to me. And keep in mind, and those of you who have been beekeeping for a few years probably understand by now that beekeepers have a lot of different views and opinions and thoughts about beekeeping and how you should do it and how you shouldn't do it. And I want to be very clear that, my experience is my experience, but I feel strongly, about certain things, but I also don't want to be a beekeeper that is not open to other things. And I really do listen to science and people who have had successes, but there is, I will warn you, there's a lot of judgment on every side, just like with anything, who's doing it right and who's not. But I would just say, sustainability to me means you're not having to buy bees every single year. And we've been on this sort of really terrible train as beekeepers where you get new beekeepers, they buy a package of bees from California, they bring it to the Midwest. Those bees were raised by commercial beekeepers. They have different needs and are treated differently than a brand new beekeeper treats them, and then they die, and then you buy bees every single year. And my mission, along with several other beekeepers in the area, well, and all over really, we're trying to figure out a way to stop this treadmill. So when I started beekeeping, a colony cost $90 to $120. Now it's $140 to $200. And that has a lot to do with demand, but also how hard it is to keep the bees alive, and we don't want them to be disposable. They're perennial animals. Yes, they're livestock as well for a lot of people, and so you have to take that into consideration. And they don't, we put them into these boxes that we designed in order to make honey, in order to observe them, which I'm glad we did, but you have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about the honeybee and how it does function in nature. So you can buy a package of bees, which for those of you who are brand new, what that means is commercial beekeepers in California, after almond production, which is the largest pollination event in the world, and 80% of the world's almonds are produced in California. And the majority of commercial beekeepers bring their colonies out there and get paid pollination contracts to pollinate the almonds. And so beekeepers don't make money off of selling honey. They make money off of selling bees to contracts. And the reason, if you look at my honey in a store and you think, wow, that's really expensive, it's because I don't do that. And that's the true cost of making honey these days. So you can buy a package of bees and it comes in 2 pounds or 3 pounds. And they basically just shake excess worker bees into a screened box. And then they put a queen who's not those worker bees' mother in with it. And then they ship it from California to the Midwest, or from Georgia, or from Florida. A nucleus colony is basically just a small colony that already has a queen and workers with it, but it comes on comb. And one of the issues you have to be really careful about is you don't really know how old those frames are or how old the comb is, and wax really absorbs a lot of the toxins and chemicals that beekeepers use, but also that are out in the environment. There's some incredibly alarming statistics about how many pesticides and chemicals are found in beehives, and down in the Delta, it's like 120 different chemicals found in beehives down there. And when I had my pesticide killed in Minnesota in 2015, the Department of Agriculture wouldn't sample the pollen because they told me they would find too much in it and they wouldn't be able to tell me anything. So that was a wake-up call as well. So in order to kind of, as beekeepers, to mitigate that problem, you want to be, cycling out your wax frames every couple years. Mostly the brood frames where the bees are raising their young. The honey frames, if it's just honey, is really clean because the bees are collecting the nectar. They're just storing it. They're not raising young in there. And that box is only on the colony for like a month or two, maybe. In overwintering bees successfully so far, and I will say that 3 years ago, I made the decision I did not want to buy bees ever again. And I've successfully not bought bees, extra bees that, and put into my operation. And I noticed that my survival and my level of disease really dramatically decreased the minute I stopped bringing in different bees from other places. So whether I, was buying commercial bees from my uncle who was going to California, or whether I was buying commercial bees from some operations in Texas in order to grow my numbers, when I decided I wanted to raise my own queens and raise my own bees, those my issues really went. I still have issues, as any beekeeper does, but I started to see less and less of them. So that's a big sign of sustainability to me. And that makes sense if you have, locally adapted stock that is more used to your climate, is not managed in a way that it's going to go to almond pollination where the bees never really get a rest. And they get frequently treated and managed for varroa. So a big challenge that we're working on, and I'm really excited. I can't really talk about it, but if you stay in contact with me and you're in the area, I'm working with some researchers and other beekeepers to try and really tackle this problem to get more locally available stock to new beekeepers and other beekeepers in the area. Anyone who takes my Camp Beez Kneez course, I will I will supply them with my own bees, or I will find them good bees in the area. So why are bees struggling? People who talk about this a lot like to mention the 3 Ps: pesticides, parasites, and poor nutrition. I've covered pesticides and parasites a little bit. Poor nutrition is, we just don't have the same kind of landscapes that we used to. And this is one of the reasons I'm incredibly motivated to work with these small diversified organic farmers, because if you go to their farm and then you go to a commercial corn or soybean farm, you're going to see a lot of insects at their farm and very few at the other, because it's just not, bees need diversity. They need lots of flowers, different pollens, different nectars. And I grew up in Minnesota. I watched in central Minnesota, and I watched the landscape very quickly change from prairie to strip malls. And so there's just less and less forage out there. And the more that as a society we move towards get big or get out, you're going to start to see more and more problems with bees and other organisms being able to compete with that model. But as a beekeeper, knowing these are an issue, which can be daunting, but I think if you go into it knowing that this is a possibility, you're going to be better prepared for the things that you can control. And so it's really hard to keep the pesticides. I mean, you can make sure you put your bees in a place that's as far away from corn and soybean fields as you can get them, wooded, or if you can't get them that far away, at least make sure there's a tree line or some sort of buffer. It's incredibly hard, especially in the Midwest, to avoid this. And well, in the country, but in the Midwest, especially, a bee's forage range is 3 to 5 miles, which is 8,000 acres in a radius. And so it's really hard. They're going to get exposed to stuff. But if you can surround them, you know, bees are really efficient and they'll go to what's closest to them. So if you can surround them with good stuff, that's ideal. Parasites, learn how to manage those. And then poor nutrition, be really, you know, just observant of your bees and when they need help with food. So I talked a little bit about this, but, you know, commercial beekeepers are keeping their bees active most of the year. So they have high production demands, and then they sell those bees to hobbyists. So yeah, when thinking about sustainable beekeeping and when I teach my students, you know, you want to talk about, like, maybe you're keeping bees for honey, or maybe you're just keeping bees because you want to learn about bees. These are all things it's good to really ask yourself before you start. And overwintering really is about understanding the cycle of the bee colony. And so these are kind of the very, you know, summed up into bullets, the seasons for the honeybee colony. In spring, you have population buildup. So they come out of winter, and the first pollen, which in our area is actually from the maple trees. So when you see your friends doing maple syrup, when they're done with the syrup, the bees are going to start flying because those trees are going to start to bud and blossom, and that provides a little bit of first nectar and pollen, as well as willows and dandelions, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Early summer, you know, the bees' whole purpose is to reproduce, and so the early summer, the hives that have overwintered are going to look to swarm, and you can use that to your advantage. And something that we're trying to teach about sustainable beekeeping is always have 2 hives, never use just one, because if something happens to one, you're out of luck. But having 2 hives, and then you can make splits and either have insurance that you'll have hives over winter, but also that you could share with your friends. Summer, so after they get through, there's a couple swarming seasons, you know, May when the dandelions come out, and then in July when the basswoods bloom and the clover blooms. So summer's about, you know, you can make new colonies and take advantage of all that honey that's out there, and build up those new colonies that you made off of your one colony. And this is more of a second year thing. But you can do it in your first year if you know what you're doing. Let's see. And then late summer, fall, you're doing honey harvest and winter prep. And then winter is dormancy, and, you know, the brood rearing ceases. So here's a really great frame of pollen and brood. So the bees, what they're doing in the spring is they're collecting that pollen, willow, maple, alder, poplar, nectar becomes more available. And pollen is really the thing that gets those bees to raise brood again. They need pollen to feed the young. Remember the bee bread I told you, but the pollen's the protein and the nectar is the carbohydrate. And so it's a kind of a complete diet, and they need both in order to raise young, but pollen is the first thing that gets them going. And if you have a really good, nice spring, like this spring was really nice because we kind of had a decent slow build, where I've had other springs where it's just cold, and then all of a sudden summer hits. So climate change can really affect this with the bees, but they're incredibly resilient in figuring it out too. And I just want to point out, for those of you who don't know, in the picture, those orange and yellow substances on the bees' legs, that's pollen. And I named my business the Bee's Knees because bees collect pollen on the back of their knees. And beekeepers talk about really good honey being the bee's knees because you're going to have traces of pollen in it. So what are you doing in the springtime? And in our classes, we talk about this a lot. You know, beekeeping, unfortunately, you have to think about winter all year round, but really that's what the bees are doing. You know, they're just, everything that they do is in support of getting the hives through the next winter, or reproducing in that hive getting through the winter. So some springs you might have to provide some supplemental feed. I really hate feeding bees, but sometimes you have to do it, especially when all your equipment is brand new. There just aren't enough workers to go out and collect enough nectar to produce wax. And wax is produced by a gland on the abdomen of the bee, and they need a lot of nectar in order to do it, and they need that wax to build their colony. So you can provide a little bit of food to boost the population. You know, if it's warm enough, you can pull out one frame and check for the health of the brood. And then if the colony, if there's something going on, you don't have a queen, sometimes in the spring you'll end up without a queen in the hive. And this is why it's nice to have two, that you can combine it with another one. Or if you have access to other queens, put a new one in there. Early summer is the first honey flow, like I mentioned, dandelions. And on the right, I love this photo because it shows the white. You see how there's the honeycomb and then there's white wax. And if you see white wax in your hive, that's brand new nectar, and it's a beautiful sight. It means the bees are on honey flow. And it can happen very, very quickly. Like within a week, you'll go back to your hive and you'll be like, wow, they put so much nectar in this colony. So you really have to pay attention, especially in early summer. If your hive overwinters, it can swarm on you very quickly. And this is something I really, really want to push on new beekeepers, is to keep an eye on this, because the way that mites spread is if your colony swarms and then you have a colony out living, or it ends up in somebody's house, or, you know, bees will drift with mites from other areas to other areas. But on the other hand, you know, there are people who are collecting swarms and trying to find the ones that are really good survivors. But if you're brand new, you really want to make sure that the bees that are swarming aren't, that they are adaptable to their area. And if you buy California bees, that's not going to be the case. So what do the bees want to be doing in that early summer flow? They're building up. You should take advantage of this time to make new colonies. So thinking about next year right away in the spring, and that, like, oh, I would really like to have more colonies, I want to grow, or perhaps you want to sell bees and pay for your hobby. But the bees are, they're gearing up for reproduction. So you want to be looking for those queen cells, those swarm cells. Weaker colonies will be building up if healthy, but not considering swarming. In regards to overwintering, this season is about building populations and bringing in necessary pollen and nectar for growth. Yeah, so this is my favorite time of year for beekeeping because the bees are nice and there's lots of nectar coming in, and it's really a good time to be inspecting colonies. So this is a swarm, and this is what happens if you don't give your bees enough room during that really crucial nectar flow time. And again, a big challenge of when you're brand new is all your equipment's new, and the bees might not get the memo that they have room because they haven't taken that wax and drawn it out into honeycomb. And this, if you ever get into catching swarms, it's one of my favorite things to do. The bees are so gentle, and it's a really good thing to teach people as well, because they see that, like, the average person, maybe you're downtown Amory and you're walking by Farm Table Foundation and there's a giant ball of bees in the trees. You're going to want to call me or another beekeeper in the area to come get it, because it's free bees. But the general public might not be super keen on this. And in fact, there's a really terrible story of St. Paul, Minnesota. We got a call that there was a swarm, and they called the fire department. The fire department spray foamed the entire hive, which was really unnecessary.
Kristy, Lindsay actually says that we should call her instead.
Yeah, I probably won't answer. So yeah, call Lindsay.
Just a quick time check. It's about almost 10 to 8, and we've got about 3 or 4 questions that have come in. So just so you know.
I'll try and cruise through.
Not necessarily. I just want you to just sort of mention that.
Yep. So why do bees swarm and when do they swarm? It's about that bee colony. Remember, if you think about it as a super organism, that bee colony wants to divide itself. So it's reproduction. It's a bee baby, I like to say. And about half of the workers leave with the old queen and they establish a new colony. And so what's left with the existing colony is a young queen that's born to start everything all over again. A lot of beekeepers discourage this, but it's actually incredibly healthy for the bees to do. But, you know, if you learn how to manage bees in a way where you take advantage of the swarming, but they don't actually swarm into the trees, you identify based on what's going on in the colony. Oh, they're getting crowded. They have a lot of honey. The queen is running out of room to lay. You can literally just take a couple frames of eggs and larvae and brood and put it in another box, and you can raise your own queen that way. You just leave it alone. And that's essentially what a swarm is. So this is what it looks like. If you go into your colony and you see all those little things that look like peanuts on the bottom of that frame, those are all queen cells, and they'll make, you know, I've seen up to like 50 swarm cells in a colony. And the reason they do that is they want to increase their chances of having a good queen come out. So the first one, you know, queen that comes out, and she'll go around and she'll kill all the other queen cells, and then she becomes the queen, which is crazy. So depending on what your choice is, you might do different things to your colonies to promote good wintering. If you want to make honey, you probably want to suppress swarming a little bit so that you don't lose half your bees and half your workforce. You're going to want to do an integrated pest management for mites. You have to control mites all year round, and that colony has to go into winter almost mite free, if not totally mite free, to have a good chance to make it through. So in order to mitigate that a little bit, we started pulling our honey earlier, before the end of July, so that the bees are going to get whatever comes in the fall. And then also it gives you time, crucial time, to do your mite observation and management. And also identifying whether or not that queen will be a good queen to keep around, or if you need to replace it with a different one. If you want to make more bees, if you don't care about honey, you just want to make sure that those divides I talked about with eggs, larvae, and brood, and some, you would use some food frames as well. Make divides and increase your population of bees. Bees are really contagious, and I know I'm addicted to making bees, even when I probably shouldn't be, but it's a really fun part of it. And then brood breaks for effective mite control. One of the reasons that swarming is so good for colonies is that it gives them it takes about 3 weeks for you to get a mated queen in that hive again. And so it gives them 3 weeks without mites that are reproducing in your colony. So the honey flow, it comes in our area. The sweet clovers are a really good plant. That's yellow sweet clover on the left there, and white sweet clover is even better. This is a plant that the DNR considers invasive. It used to be planted to feed livestock, but it's an incredible honey plant. If you've ever had clover honey, this is what it comes from. And clover is nitrogen fixing. It's really actually good for pastures, but it can take over. And so that's why the DNR doesn't necessarily like it that much. It's been great to be working with pastured livestock farmers who are incorporating clovers into their landscapes. Like I mentioned, that white wax. And then what are they doing? What are the bees doing in late June to early July? They're gonna, that's second main swarm season. Basswood, which actually hasn't really been blooming that much in the last couple years. Last year we had an incredible hailstorm here, which took out a lot of blossoms on the basswood tree. But this year it just, for whatever reason, the trees didn't give off a lot of nectar, but it can be an incredible nectar plant. Bees, they're hoarding that honey. So as long as we in sustainable beekeeping, or my opinion of it, leave them with enough honey to get through the winter. Some breeds of bees are better about storing honey than others. You might have to feed if we don't get enough fall flow, or they don't pack enough in there, depending on the kind of bee. Italian honeybees are really bad at holding on to nectar because they're from Italy, right? And in Italy, you have many, many floral seasons where we only have a short 3-month period where flowers are blooming. This is a picture of what it looks like when you're raising queens. And so grafting, so if you want to make more colonies, you're going to need more queens unless you let the bees make them yourself. You're piling on honey supers, you're making queens, and you're doing mite checks. I talked about packages and nukes. Here's a photo of a package installation. I don't use package bees anymore. That's my uncle who sells nukes. But like I said, I'm trying not to buy nukes that aren't from my own operation, and I sell nukes that are raised in the area. Honey harvest. It's just a picture of our honey extraction room, pedal powered extractors in action. In the fall, the bees are collecting their last pollen and nectar, and the last populations of young bees are being reared. The queens are beginning to slow down, and late summer, fall offspring need to be super healthy to have. So your winter bees, this is why it's incredibly important to treat for mites or take care of mites before winter, or monitor them, because the varroa mite actually, for years, they thought was feeding on the bee blood, hemolymph of the bee, but they found out a couple years ago, a researcher discovered that the mites were actually feeding on the fat bodies of the bee. So it would be like our liver, like if a giant tick the size of a dinner plate was feeding on your liver before you had to go through 6 months of winter time. It'd be terrible. And those fat bodies, the winter bees actually have more fat bodies because they produce more vitellogenin, which is another really important chemical and secretion in their head. And if they're not fed well and they have mites feeding on them before winter, they don't really stand a chance of making it through those 6 months. This is a graph that kind of shows the mite, the way that the bee population grows in May and June. it's at the peak where bees are at 50 to 60,000 honeybees in a colony. But then they start to slow down in reproduction, but the mites never stop. And so that's why it's really important to take care of them and monitor all season long. So why do honeybees colonies die over the winter? What are the things that you can control in that situation? Well, you can control moisture. So you're going to want to, what I just did last week with all of my colonies is I put some foam insulation on the top and allowed a little hole at the top of the colony and one at the bottom to move moisture throughout the colony. That colony is clustered and they're breathing, and it's 80 to 90 degrees inside, even when it's this cold outside. And they're producing heat and eating honey to produce energy to produce heat. So there's a lot of moisture that can build up in there, and you don't want that moisture to fall down onto the bodies of the bees. So these are the main reasons that they can die. Starvation, make sure they're fully fed before winter time. Of course, if they've been exposed to too much disease. Extreme cold, you know, I've seen colonies get through some really cold weather. I think it has more to do with the other three. This is just a photo of using an infrared camera to show where the heat of the colony is. This is super fun and a great way to not disturb the colony, but know it's alive just by putting an infrared camera on it. This is a technique that is made famous by a beekeeper out of Vermont named Mike Palmer, where a lot of these ideas come from. Check out his YouTube channel. He does like a 2-hour video on sustainable beekeeping, and he came up with this idea where if you look at this photo, one side has one colony in it and the other side has another colony in it, and the idea is that they benefit from the heat of each other. And that's kind of what it looks like in the winter. When you lift it up, there's a board in the middle separating the colonies, and they both have separate entrances. Or using nucleus colonies, which are more the size of a tree cavity. They're long and narrow, and it's less area that the bees have to thermoregulate. And so this is something that's kind of relatively new. It's not new in the bee world, but it's becoming more and more used as a way to get colonies through the winter. So you make nuke colonies, which are just smaller colonies, and with a young queen in the summertime, and that colony will be your honey producing colony the following year. So going into winter, I have a mix of colonies that were honey producers the year before, and then colonies that will be my honey producers the following year. So they're more efficient way to overwinter. You can raise your own queens. I also would really recommend this if you're a smaller person and that doesn't want to handle the really big boxes that can weigh 100 pounds. Start with a nuke, and they're really easy to manage. And I really would encourage anyone, in fact, I want to design some curriculum that is around raising one normal size colony and then one nucleus colony. You can do swarm control, you can raise your own queens, you can raise brood to help out weaker colonies, and they seem to have a better buildup in spring because of that size of the box. This is the varroa mite that I've been talking about. I probably should have introduced it a little bit earlier, but perspective on the size of a bee, that's like the size of a dinner plate. And so the way that we do it, we only treat when we have to, but every 3 weeks I'm taking mite samples, which I use powdered sugar. There are videos all over the internet on how to do this. If you can do a brood break, which is a time when the queen is not laying, and there's a couple different ways to do this, whether you're doing splits and divides and raising your own bees. Drone comb removal, which is what I talked about, trapping the mites on a frame of drones. And then I feed it to my chickens. And I think I might have a picture of that. Yep. So you can see the frame is all drones, and they actually, beekeeping supply companies will sell this frame with the imprint of drone cells on it, or if you put a empty frame in the middle of a brood nest or 3 frames into the colony, the bees are going to make drones. And then you just have to make sure you get there before day 24. You pull it out. It's a really great system. My chickens always run up super excited when I show up with this in my truck. And I just want to mention the organic acids. There's formic acid and oxalic acid. These are the only harsh treatments that we use. They are organic, but they are, hard on the bees. And so you only want to use them when you need to. Queens. Hygienic means that bees have been bred. You're identifying the fact that the bees themselves can identify mites, and there's a different way to do this. I can, answer questions later about this. But basically, you freeze kill a patch of brood, and then you put it back in the colony, and 24 hours later, you count the number of cells that the bees cleaned out because they identified something was wrong, and that will tell you how hygienic your colony is. This is something Dr. Marla Spivak, she won a MacArthur Genius Award for that work. So how do we continue to support honeybees and other pollinators? I want to encourage people to, if you're not going to become a beekeeper, becoming a beekeeper isn't necessarily going to save the bees, but it's a really great way to educate yourself and be a part of a learning experience about nature that is invaluable. If there's something wrong with your honeybees, is generally related to what's going on in the landscape and the way that we're growing food. And I harp on this a lot, but I think it's incredibly important to understand how our food system is connected to the survival of species, including native pollinators who are having a lot harder time than honeybees are because they don't have something managing them and keeping them alive. And I have a video to share, but it's kind of late, so maybe I'll send it to you all later. But last December, I had a sit-down conversation with all the farmers where I keep bees, and we talked about the sustainable farming and how it affects bees. And I would just encourage you to, in your area, support those farmers as much as possible, as well as any efforts politically that are focused on bees. On a federal level, we don't have an administration at the current moment that really cares about the environment all that much, but hopefully that will change. And I think the most important place, as I learned in my work in Minnesota, is to go to your local representatives and see what you can do in your local area. So I can take questions now. Sorry, I went a long time.
Kristy, people are really appreciating what you have to share. And I can go over some questions here. Okay. Folks, if, this was advertised as going from 6:30 to 8. If you need to go, know that it will be, this is being recorded, and then I'll send out a link to that once I get it up onto YouTube. So you will have that as a resource too. But if you can stay, please do. And so let's see. How do you capture the mites from the drones, and how do you personally control mites are 2 questions. Yeah, so I think I mentioned those the drone comb frames is what I use to trap the mites in the drone comb. And you just want to make sure that you place, you just put an empty frame with no foundation. I call it position 3, which means, you have a frame closest to you, and then the 3rd frame, you replace that with an empty frame around May, and they'll start to put drones in there. And then you just want to, I usually mark it on a calendar and then go out there on day 20, and I just cut the frame out and take that away. You can also freeze that frame and put it back in the colony, and they'll clean it out. So that's how I use drones to capture mites. Oop, I lost audio.
You're
Okay,
muted.
there we go.
Yeah.
Recommendations for local bee product suppliers such as propolis and bee pollen?
So, you know, I know Nancy Red Clover Herbal Apothecary who sells at Farm Table Foundation, but she also sells online. She's an herbalist where I keep bees at her place, and she does a propolis tincture that's really good. As far as bee pollen, I'd be really careful with bee pollen because a lot of pesticides end up in pollen, and the bees really need as much pollen as they can get. So I'm not the best person to talk to about pollen.
Okay, I just typed that in there, folks. Red Clover Herbal Apothecary, which is here just outside of Amory, and you can check them out on the website if you like. Let's see. Someone says, basic question: how do you feed bees? As you were saying.
Yeah. So you're gonna use sugar water. Sometimes I don't really use pollen patties. That's a whole nother discussion. But sugar water you're gonna have to use when you get brand new equipment, like I said, because it replicates nectar. I use cane sugar, and you get larger bags at Costco for a really good deal of cane sugar. You don't want to feed organic because the way they process organic sugar will give the bees dysentery. So that's kind of one of the harder things about, you know, wanting to do things organic. Organic sugar doesn't work very well for that. But so you mix a solution of sugar, 1 part hot water and 1 part sugar. So I basically just take like a 1 gallon bucket, I fill it with sugar, and then I put that aside, and then I take a 1 gallon bucket of water, and then I heat that to just before boiling, and then I mix it together. And there's several different styles of feeders you can buy for bees, but the simplest is just a bucket feeder, which you put on top of the hive. And when you turn over the bucket of liquid feed, the capillary force will keep the water from rushing out. You have these little holes in the bottom of the bucket, and then the bees will just suck sugar water right out of there. So in the fall time, if you're trying to get them fat before winter and they didn't make enough honey, then you're going to want to use 2 to 1 because that more replicates what the consistency of honey, and they don't have to process it as much. But 1 to 1 sugar water is what we use.
Great, thanks, Kristy. Is there any way we can control or support the hives in the previous year so we don't have to feed them in the springtime?
Yeah, so that would, if you don't want to feed them in the springtime, I would just recommend taking less honey. So depending on how many boxes that you keep your bees in, you know, I would recommend making sure that they have at least a deep full of honey, which a deep is a bigger, it's the biggest size box you can get. But that's really the way to do it, is just not take as much honey in the summer, and make sure. I will weigh my colonies as well. So, you know, depending on the kinds of bees you have, they're going to eat more than others. And I mentioned it, I have a mix, like we call it a Minnesota mutt, but I have a mix of Russian bees are really good. The Russian bee breeders did a study that showed that Russian bees only eat 16 pounds of honey throughout the winter, where like an average colony needs anywhere from 75 to 100 extra pounds of honey. So I would just, when you're new and getting started, just make sure you leave them a full deep of honey, and that should be plenty.
And then there's been a little discussion in the chat about, you know, besides mites, you know, are there other things you have to be careful about, or, you know, raccoons or deer or other critters, skunks, etc.?
Yeah, so actually the biggest, I mean, bears are a huge problem in Western Wisconsin. I recommend you invest in a fence, a really strong fencer. I use, they're called, I'll write it in here, it's called Par Mac Solar Fencer. That's really the best that I've found. They're around $200 to $300, but that's about the cost of a hive. And if a bear gets to your colony, it's gone. So make sure your fence is set up and hot before you put bees in there, because once the bears find them, they will keep coming back. I've only had issues with skunks a little bit, but they've never really, I suspect it was skunks that killed these hives, but I wasn't sure. But I did have an electric fence. Mice are really a big deal. And in the winter time, actually in September, you're going to want to put what we call mouse guards on any entrances so those bees can't move in.
What about winter feeding when the water sugar mixture would freeze?
So you wouldn't want to feed the water mixture. You can make a sugar cake. And there's a recipe. I have a blog that I can also share. I'll share it right now. And it has a recipe for sugar cakes. And that would be emergency feeding. Ideally, you leave your bees enough to get through the winter. You close them up. Like I closed my bees up in October and I haven't looked at them, and I won't look at them again until February. If your bees, I think that's it. If your bees make it past the new year, that is a really good indication they're going to make it till spring. If they die before the new year, it means it's probably disease related. But they eat most of their honey. They don't eat a lot of honey until after the winter solstice. So December 21st, they start to kind of raise a small amount of brood. And that's when they're going to start to really go through more of their honey stores. And so January, February, March are, you want to just check and see if that hive is light or not. And you can do that just by lifting the back of it.
Okay, another question. What was the Russian queen stat again? Someone wanted to know that.
The Russian queen, what?
It says Russian queen stat.
Oh, they did a study on the amount of honey consumed by a Russian hive. It was 16 pounds through the entire winter. And I can attest to, I've had hives from Russian genetics that in the springtime, it's incredible how much honey they have. And this is why we're working really hard on trying to identify those hives that are able to not eat a lot and store a lot of honey. It's generally a darker bees like Caucasian bees or Russian bees. They're not going to be like your kind of orange gold bee. They're going to be more of a black bee. Yeah.
Let's see. We have one other question that I think I've gotten them all. Do you use Plasticell?
No, several years ago, I made the decision not to use any plastic foundation in my colonies anymore. So it's another reason that we partner with Better Bee for equipment, because they have pure wax foundation. And I do the old school labor intensive wiring of frames and then embedding wax foundation into it. The bees like it better. I don't have to put a bunch of plastic in the landfill when I'm cycling out my frames. And extracting wax foundation, you just have to be, make sure it's wired correctly and installed correctly. And then you don't want to, spin it too fast. I've extracted wax from wax foundation just fine, actually.
Well, I bet there's a lot more questions out there because you have so much great information. It's really impressive, Kristy.
Thanks.
Thank you. It is 8:15. Does anyone have any final question or anything you'd like to say? You could always unmute yourself for briefly.
Oh, yeah. I'll also put my email address in here if anyone wants to follow up. And that blog has a lot of good information, and I try to be funny, so hopefully that translates. Oh, courses for next year. So it's called Camp Beez Kneez. There's a link on my website, and I will open up registration in early January, because it'll be something, it's really hard for me to predict the future right now or to make plans, but we will hold the course. It's just, I don't know how many. So we'll probably take a waiting list, and then those on the waiting list. So if you're really interested in the course, just email me and I'll make sure to get you on that list.
Great. And I also typed in your Farm Table Restaurant's address in Amory. Kristy has emphasized supporting the farmers that she works with and on which she has her bees. And she's so right that they're really seeking to honor, biodiversity, soil health, climate issues, nutrient dense food. All those are top of their minds, and they're creating great food in the midst of all that. So if you can support those farmers, one of the ways you can do that is by eating at our restaurant. So that's another option. And many of those groups also have their own CSAs, or you can buy from them directly. And right now, yeah, good question, Nicole. We have been seating people at 15 to 25% capacity. We're taking it very seriously. We may end up needing to go to take and bake or curbside or grab and go only, but right now we're still open for 15 to 25% capacity, and we all wear masks and so on, those who work there. But yeah, it's obviously getting pretty bad, the pandemic here in Wisconsin. So,
hey Mike, can I just put one more plug in for ways to, so you probably are aware of this, and I don't know how many folks are from the area listening, but the threat of the CAFO, the large CAFO moving in, is an effort that I just want to, in order to support small farmers in this area and the health of landscape for bees, we really need to be paying attention to things that are trying to move into the area that would be harmful. And so I'm very active. If anyone wants to learn more about its confinement animal feeding operation, there's 26,000 hog operation that is threatening to move 3 miles north of my house in Burnett. I'm in Burnett County, but Farm Table's in Polk, and a lot of the beekeepers I work with there are in Polk County. And 26,000 hogs would mean 200,000 babies going to different areas in Polk and Burnett, and it'd be really, really hard on our small local sustainable farms. So just pay attention to that kind of farming threat in our area.
Yeah, thanks a lot for mentioning that, Kristy. Farm Table has been seeking to promote that work as well, and somewhat involved in the efforts to educate and combat that issue. I've typed in there a quote, I'll send it: "How we eat determines to a considerable extent how the world is used." And concentrated animal feeding operations is one way we can choose to eat, and supporting small local farms is another. So yeah, and of course, policies that support one type of farm or another are also important to pay attention to, as Kristy has talked about tonight in the policy work she's gotten involved with around bees. Feel free to be in touch with me, program director at farmtablefoundation.org. And Kristy, hope you know that a lot of people typed in their thanks in the chat box.
I'm watching, and it's much appreciated, and good to have a good audience. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I'll be in touch with an email and so on in the next few days. And Kristy, thank you so much for your time and expertise and care.
You're welcome. We'll talk to you soon, Mike. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Take care.